So today's theme is you don't have to suffer anymore. And I'm slightly chuckling because a part of me is thinking, Corinne, how can you be so arrogant to think you have the answer as to how to stop suffering? But I am a student along the same path that we are all walking right now. And I genuinely do believe that we no longer need to suffer. And I know I'm not the first person to say this. I've listened to many people, talk about the same thing, that we've just come to a time in our existence as a humanity where we don't need to evolve through suffering anymore. And I feel like I've also been really working on a personal level to not need to grow through suffering anymore. I've done that a lot in my life. And I can really feel it's like a tired story, right? I've done it. I have the t-shirt. It's all good. We can move on. We can let go. And if you've heard me speak before, I've talked about it in, ways as it's like we've played that game and like as if this were a video game, and we can take it out of the Xbox and like put in a new one. And it's so ironic that I use that analogy because I don't like video games. But anyway, today I want to talk about, we don't need to suffer anymore. And so what are the steps? Like, what is the trajectory? Dare I use that word? Because trajectory sounds like such a straight linear line, and it's not that. But what are the steps? What are the motions? What is the cycle to get to this place where we can let go of suffering once and for all? So it's a big topic. I'm going to do my best to be as succinct as possible. Let's see where it goes. Let's dive in. This is Corinne Bloom, and you're listening to Raw Conversations. So, if you look to the outer world right now, well, depending how you're looking at it, to be honest, but if you look to the outer world, you could say, well, Corinne, what the hell are you talking about? Because there's a hell of a lot of suffering out there. So, as within, so without. Right? So the external reflection, like what is going on in the external world, you could say is still an aspect of it, at least, is a reflection of what's going on inside. So if you want to change the outside, it has to start on the inside. When we think about how we're going to change the world and people look outside to some savior, it's not going to happen that way. You are going to change the world. We are going to change the world. And it happens with all of us going in. It's never going to be found on the outside. Even if you want to pray to God, it's not outside of you. It's inside of you. And so we have so much distraction. And so why I say an aspect of it is the reflection of what's going on inside, but there also is a manipulation going on that wants to continue suffering, segregation, separation, basically that which we are not. It wants to continue that story. But for us to change it, you got to stop playing that game, and you've got to stop believing in that. So every single time you look out into the world, I don't even pay attention to it anymore because it's the same freaking formula every single time. I'm not spiritually bypassing, but I'm going inside to make the change. And I know a lot of people think, oh, that's bullshit. You have to actually tangibly do something. You are tangibly doing something. Because if you go inside and you do the inner work and you change how you show up in the world, that is what changes the world. Because you make different choices, because you perceive things differently, so you treat people differently, and you don't fall into the illusions or the traps of segregation, separation, judgment. Judgment is a huge one. If you follow my work, you know that judgment is the biggest cause of suffering. The biggest cause of suffering. So I will speak to judgment a little bit more in depth later, but I want to continue on this thread. So the moment that you catch yourself going into division, I'm more right than you are. This opinion is more right than yours. This choice, this politician, this, this food, this whatever it is where it pushes segregation and division, we are going further and further away from home, and we will suffer. We will suffer. So if we want to change the world and we want to get out of this game, which my feeling, my sense is a lot of people are starting to get fed up. There's still a lot of people playing the game. They are happy to go online and argue and fight and be right more than peaceful. There are still loads of people doing that. But I actually think in these years, there is a wave of more and more people that are going, God, are we still playing this game? Are we still doing this? Are we still fighting? Come on, can we not be grown-ups here? And I think part of this is evolution is I don't even want to use the word spiritual because it's really has all of these various connotations, which I don't like anymore. I just don't have a word for it. But for lack of a better term, I will use it. We're becoming spiritual adults, right? Because we've really been functioning kind of more from a place of adolescence. And I'm not saying that with any kind of judgment or not to patronize, and I include myself in it. When I say we, I mean us as a collective, as a species in this, whatever you want to call it, simulation, game, synthesis, experiment, great grand experiment. And I think there's enough of us that are saying, God, we're just repeating the same cycles over and over again. And we've woken up to it, right? Our self-awareness is enough online for us to go, do we really want to do this again? So I always like to look at micro and macro. As within, so without. So anything that you want to see change in the world, you first have to look at how am I creating that within myself. So I'm going to attempt to try and go through kind of the motions of how firstly do we create suffering, and then how do we begin to move away from suffering so that we're not so identified with it, so that we can actually just literally let go of that paradigm, let go of that program, let go of the game, whatever you want to call it. So let's clarify what suffering is. God, that's actually really hard. Because my first thought would be, well, suffering is pain. But suffering and pain are actually different. And I'm going to go back and use an example that a shaman, forgive me, I don't remember his name, but I thought this was really brilliant. So he was saying that pain, he used the example of a shower. You go from a hot shower to a freezing cold shower. Pain could be described as when you turn on the cold water. Let's say this is winter time and you've taken this nice, hot, lovely, cozy, hot shower and you're going to turn it cold. The pain is when the cold hits your body and you're like, yikes. But he said suffering is when the shower is still hot, but you put your hand on the handle and you have not yet turned it to cold, but you're anticipating the pain. That's suffering. Suffering is in the mind. So the way that I often speak about this when it comes to emotions is I say, I call it unnecessary suffering. So we might have the pain of the emotion. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's heartbreak. Maybe it's despair. Maybe it's hopelessness. Maybe it's loneliness. That can be painful, right? Those emotions can feel painful. The suffering that we add to it, the unnecessary suffering, is the story and the meaning and the projection that we lather on top of it and that we make of it, right? So I can have, let's use heartbreak as an example. You have the pain of heartbreak, but then the unnecessary suffering could be the story of I'm not lovable, and I'm not wanted, and I'm rejected, or I'm abandoned, and I will always be alone, and nobody loves me. And that is a whole story that is not based in reality. Or it could be based off of something that happened in the past, but it's the past, it's not the present. And just because you experienced it in the past doesn't mean that you have to experience it again in the future. The reason why we experience things again in the future is because sometimes we replicate the past. We take the template of the past, we bring it into our present moment because we keep on reliving the past, and therefore that is what we create in the future. But that essentially is a choice. Even if it's not conscious, it's actually still a choice that we're making. So suffering is actually something that is really unnecessary, but what many kind of people, whatever you want to call them, spiritual teachers, gurus, whatever, it doesn't matter, the title doesn't matter. We've gone through a period of time as a humanity where that was the game. It's like, okay, how can we evolve through suffering? This is interesting. This is different than who we are and our natural state of being when we're not in bodies, when we haven't incarnated, right? Our immortal soul is unconditional love. It is infinite, right? It doesn't feel that kind of limitation. It doesn't feel that segregation or judgment. So we've been playing this game of that which we are not. And how do we grow and expand? Because consciousness always wants to grow. It always is expanding. And the soul, as a droplet of that, of source itself, is also curious and wanting to constantly grow and expand. So I think but going back to what I said before, we've kind of tired out that story, right? We've done it. We all have the t-shirt. I don't think we need to do it again. I think we've gotten as much as we can possibly get from it. And then it kind of gets to the point of like, well, am I evolving from suffering, or am I actually just falling into the victim of the story and identity and paradigm of suffering? And as a coach, as an authenticity coach, I've guided enough people now over the last 15 years where I can recognize the ones, and it breaks my heart because it's a hard place to be. I really have a lot of compassion for it. But the ones that so want to change and grow and evolve and move beyond their patterning, but they are still so identified with the victim. They are so attached to their suffering. And it's, sometimes it's really hard. Like one of the hardest pieces of doing the inner work is the self-responsibility piece, because people think, oh, if I take self-responsibility, that I'm blaming myself or I'm berating myself, or, it's like, I have to take responsibility, and that means that it's like I have to tell myself how terrible I am, that I'm addicted to being a victim and I'm addicted to suffer. No, it's so the opposite. It's like it's coming from fear. The ego does not want to let go of its identity. It doesn't give a shit if its identity is causing you suffering. It just wants to exist, right? So we can get very wrapped up and identified with our suffering, with our victimization. And this is where I like to often use the term like, okay, let's zoom out. Let's zoom out a little bit, because, okay, let's really, really zoom out. And this is really for people that are on a more metaphysical, spiritual path. If you believe that you are just your body, then we're limited. But if you know that you are not your body is just a vehicle. It is the avatar. It is what makes it possible to be in this third density and to have this experience. But the driving force is your soul. Well, the larger driving force is consciousness, God, source, creator itself, right? That's really who's behind at the helm, behind the wheel, the steering wheel. But let's just keep it within our experience a little bit tighter in. It's our soul that is kind of guiding this vessel. But when we're really attached to the vessel, things get really kind of like almost claustrophobic is the word that comes into my mind, because it gets all very dense, because the body is dense. That's what brings us into the third density, right? It's dense. And this is why maybe for some of us, we get really frustrated. It's like, why don't things happen faster? Because outside of this density, they do. But we're also playing with like limitation. But I think that's another one of those things that we can let go of. It's like through the duality, we've learned a lot. We've expanded a lot, because the duality creates the point of tension. It creates the polarity. It creates the mirror effect. It creates I'm looking at myself from a differing perspective. And what I was just listening to this guy called RJ, Spain. I'm so bad with names. I'm so sorry. I will always remember a face, but not so much a name. It will come to me. And he was talking about how, like the beauty, we'll put it in my own words, but the beauty of duality is showing us how we can move from one thing to the other. And for me, the term that I like to use is alchemy. Alchemy, we are learning to be alchemists through duality. So you go from greed to generosity, from suffering to whatever, gratitude, joy. I love actually something that he said, which I 100% agree with, is he was saying most people think that the opposite of love is hatred, but it's not. The opposite of love is judgment. And this is why I talk about judgment so much, unconditional love and judgment, because that's what I see as the source of all suffering. When I'm working with people, the source of their suffering is the judgment of their experience. If you don't judge your experience, it's just an experience. It just is. It might be, like I said, some emotions might be more uncomfortable than others, but it's just an experience. What creates suffering is when you think this isn't good. I shouldn't be. I should be doing that instead. Or other people are going to judge me. My parents are going to judge me. My peers are going to judge me. Society's going to judge me. They're going to oust me. They're going to reject me. They're going to abandon me. They're not going to love me. That's all judgment. Because all this is right here is an experience. It's actually neither good or bad or right or wrong. It's just an experience. The meaning you give to it is what makes it into something. Two people can take the same exact experience, and one makes it good and one makes it bad. One makes it turns it into wisdom, and I want to talk about that word in a moment, and one turns it into suffering. And it's all a matter of perspective, and perspective is a matter of choice. Now, sometimes it's not a conscious choice, but what we're doing by building self-awareness is we're making the unconscious conscious. And the moment you can make something conscious, which was habitual, you can change it, and that is how we take our power back, and that's how we truly engage with life. And that's how we change our realities, all in our, it's all in our choice. And when we make the unconscious conscious and we bring self-awareness in and we can make a choice, now we have freedom. Now we have true freedom. Because when we're not aware and we're being run by habitual unconscious behaviors, we're prisoners to that. And that's part of why we also suffer. Because we're not fully engaged with what is, because in order to be fully engaged with what is, we have to be awake to it. We have to know that we're sitting behind the steering wheel, right? Most people are in an Uber, right? Then you got to get yourself to the front seat, and then you got to get yourself into the driver's seat. And also knowing that the vehicle that you're in is guided by something else. Like we think that we're driving it, but there's also lots of other things, mechanisms that come in that are actually allowing for that vehicle to be there and to move, for it to exist and to move. And another analogy that I liked that this guy RJ talked about, this is a really simple but very succinct analogy for those that are still really attached to the idea that you are your body and that's it. He said, when you get in a car, you don't think you are the car. You're just getting in the car, and the car is the vehicle that is going to take you somewhere. That's no different than the soul is using the body to take it somewhere, to have an experience. And I love that because, yeah, you don't get in the car and go, oh, I'm a car. No, you're driving the car. Right? I love that. So succinct. I love simple, succinct analogies. I think they're so brilliant. So when we zoom out and we realize we're not this body, it gives us spaciousness. It gives us a sense of, yeah, like I just want to exhale a little bit because it gives us a broader perspective. We're going into the macro. We're going into the eagle's perch that is looking from above. Because sometimes when you're in the inertia of like your drama of life, of being human, it's really helpful to expand out and go, okay, I'm not just this body. I'm not just Corinne, that sometimes, quite frankly, just annoys me. Her personality annoys me. I say that with love. That's why I can joke. I can laugh. Because I think this is one of the things. It's like as I'm working, consciously on letting go of suffering, humor gets to come in a lot more. And when you build awareness, nothing gets through, right, without it being caught. And I'm not claiming at all to be an enlightened person, but I have to say I've been working 20 years on self-awareness and nothing gets past me, and it's really annoying because you can't just be in ignorance and the bliss of naivety and ignorance, right? I catch it when I'm like, why are you reacting that way, Corinne? And it's not mean, it's not berating, but I always have this, my higher self going, you could make a different choice. You know that you're really overreacting right now, or you could say, parenting is the most amazing teacher, hard as hell, but the most amazing teacher because, again, even when I have a reaction, right? I'm the other day I got reactive towards my daughter. I had a migraine. It was my second day of the migraine. It was like insanely, stupidly hot. And we were going to the sea, and she's normally in charge of the umbrella, and it's normally in the back seat so that she can just take it out. And she had wanted to put it in the boot, in the trunk of the car the other day. And I was like, ooh, okay, we're gonna forget it. And lo and behold, we had walked like part of the way there, and it was like, it's a bit of a walk to get to the sea from the car. And I was like, we don't have the umbrella. And we're walking back, and I totally go into reaction. And I'm upset with her, and I'm telling her like, we have to keep it in the back of the car. I go into reactivity, and I can see her poor face, her poor sweet face. And I'm noticing it all, and I'm going, Corinne, why are you choosing this? Like, okay, I want to have a little compassion here for the human. Because I was under a lot of pressure, right? I had a migraine, which when you have a migraine, you just can't really function. And so I still had to be a parent. It was really hot. There were so many things that were adding up. And so I have compassion and patience for my human, that in that moment, my human was like, I can't handle it. This is too much pain. But I was observant. It was like, why are you making this choice right now? And so I was able to stop. And then the thing that I've gotten good at is I will say, I'm sorry. I had a reaction, and I'm sorry. I could see how that made you feel. And I will take ownership. I will take responsibility. And so there was a point of sharing this whole story with you, but this is tying into actually what I talked about earlier, is self-responsibility. Self-responsibility isn't berating oneself. Self-responsibility is actually just owning our experience and recognizing that we're not a victim to it. We're not at the mercy of it. We can be at the mercy of it. We can be a victim to it. But the moment you have awareness, you get to make a different choice. And then that's what sets you free. Because I didn't need to continue the suffering of being in reactivity, or to cause suffering to my poor child that just forgot. She's a kid. It's okay. Right? The moment you can take self-responsibility and you can stop something through awareness and make a different choice, everyone wins. Everyone is set free in that moment. There is no more suffering. If I stayed in the reaction, if she's felt even worse and worse and worse, what is that doing? That's creating more and more suffering. Let's not do that anymore, right? So when I was younger, I'm jumping a little bit, but when I was younger, well, I say younger, but like in my teens, in my 20s, even in my 30s, when I was writing a book, there was a whole chapter, a whole section on suffering and surrender. Because what would happen is I would suffer so much, and then I'd get to the point of like forced surrender. And now I'm learning the art of, if you just surrender much earlier on, you don't have to suffer so much. So I feel like I learned a lot from suffering. I learned a lot from challenge. I learned a lot from my struggles. I learned a lot from injury. I learned a lot from illness. I learned a lot from, like trauma from my childhood and all of these things. I did learn a lot and I did grow a lot, but I think I've gotten to a point in my life where I'm like, yeah, I can graduate from that. Right. And so here we come back to, can we bow down to that aspect and go, thank you for everything that I learned, but I don't need to learn through that way anymore. And so I do think this is a choice because, like I said, I had the honor to witness people through their human evolution. Being a guide, I don't like the word coach, but being a guide, I get to witness people and I do get to guide them. And that's a big responsibility. But I get to witness their growth. I get to witness their evolution. But I also witness, and so I learn a lot from it, I witness how they are still sometimes stuck in it. And sometimes they have to be in it for a while. Who knows? There's learning there. I don't have any judgment. I'm not going to force someone to do it faster than they should because maybe there's a reason why they're still in it. But I do think that collectively, like I said, I think we've tired out the game. We're getting very close to taking it out of the Xbox and putting something else in. And as Richard Rudd has talked about, like we can also still evolve through bliss. We can evolve through joy. We can evolve through kindness and compassion. I can definitely see how when I drop into that space where I feel really in my heart and my heart feels really open and tender and compassionate and loving, and I feel very generous, and even the way that I relate with my daughter, I know I'm evolving in those moments. So this whole idea that you can only grow through suffering, it's the same as what Liz Gilbert said years ago of you can only be an artist through suffering. No, she's like, no, that's not true. That's not true. And we need to get out of that like identity, right? You can only be an artist if you're starving and suffering and poor. And no, inspiration comes in all ways. You just have to be open to it. Right? So as I shared last week and many times before, the old world is crumbling. The old paradigms are crumbling. But part of the crumbling and part of like, if we want to move through this a little bit faster, is we've got to let go of being identified with the suffering and with the victimization. And part of that is actually letting go of the whole freaking game and thinking you need authority and you need somebody outside of you to tell you what to do and what you should do and what's good and what's bad. And, you should eat this, you should take that. Get out of any kind of external authority to live your life for you. This is part of the self-responsibility piece. You are a sovereign being. You are responsible for your stuff. You don't need overlords to tell you how to do it. But part of that means is you don't get to be a quote unquote spiritual child anymore. You get to be a quote unquote spiritual adult, and you're going to find freedom in that because that's where autonomy and sovereignty lies. But it means you got to hold your shit with love. I'm all for with love, not with judgment, but you got to hold your shit. And this like threads into everything. So when I say as within, so without, or micro and macro, this is not only in the world, this is in your relationships. How many relationships, and I want to do a whole podcast on this still, but how many relationships are still in codependency? How many relationships are still in victimization or damsel in distress and savior? How many are still trying to play out their childhood wounds and you need to replace the void of my father and you need to replace the void of my mother? You need to heal the wound that was from my father. You need to heal the wound that was from my mother. How many of us are still playing that role and we're still kind of like a child, the metaphoric archetypal child that hasn't yet taken self-responsibility? So this is how we're evolving right now as we're growing up. And it's a beautiful thing to take self-responsibility because guess what? Your relationships are going to be so much better. They're not going to be codependent. They're going to be interdependent. You're going to be two mature adults that know how to communicate and be vulnerable and be humble. And sometimes it might bring you to your knees because you're going to have to be really fucking humble when your shadow comes up. Excuse my language. But through that, I remember having a relationship in my 20s that we really, our contract was very, I know he was a soulmate of mine, and our contract was very much to help each other. I'll use the term, for lack of a better one, to spiritually grow. And I remember feeling he makes me want to be a better person, not because I'm not good enough, but he makes me want to grow. I remember feeling that. I was 22 years old. That's what we want to be doing, but we can't grow if we're replicating the same patterns of behavior, making the same choices and being unconscious and handing over our authority to something else and expecting the savior to come in and make it better. Like, that is all still a victim mentality. It is. Or it's a hierarchical perspective that someone that's higher and better than you is going to make it better. And so when shit is going wrong, you get to blame whatever, something out there, when actually all of it is within our responsibility. And everything that's happening outside of us is a reflection. So let's come back to the whole point of this, which is, if we want to change the world and if we want to stop suffering, we've got to look within us, right? As within, so without. So all we have control of is what is happening inside of us. So if I were to kind of put it into steps or motions or whatever, a cycle, the first point is to recognize and acknowledge, where are you causing yourself suffering? What story are you telling yourself? What beliefs are you still believing in? What identity do you have attached to that belief and that story that you're still clinging on to that's causing you suffering? The second step is to disidentify with it. You are not that. You are an eternal, infinite being. But even as a personality, even if that's too far stretched for you right now, even as a personality, even me as Corinne, I am not my beliefs. I created my beliefs. I created this story. So I don't have to identify. I don't even have to identify with the emotion. I can just feel the emotion. But the moment I identify with the emotion, then I'm creating suffering. So like an example is when someone says, I am rejected. I say, no, you're not rejected. You feel rejected. It's okay to feel rejected. But the moment you say, I am rejected, you are identifying with that. You are becoming that. You are making that everything. When anybody does something where they don't like you, you reaffirm, I am rejected. Rather than just saying, I am me. I am worthy, I am lovable, I am significant, I matter as I am, who I am, that is my birthright. But I feel in this moment rejected. And this also really helps in relationships, because if you're identified, believe you me, you're going to have 1,000,001 arguments, and they're all going to be the same argument because you are so identified with whatever that thing is. And when we're identified, it's very hard to change it. When we feel something, we can feel it, we can perceive it, we can talk about it, we can communicate to our partner about it, we can say what this feeling needs, we can ask for what that need requires. There's a whole conversation, there's a whole lot of possibility. But when we are identified, the ego goes, this is who I am, and I'm not going to change because this is what makes me feel safe. I am who I am, right? So I am rejection. It's not going to want to let go of it because it's life or death for the ego. It doesn't care. Like I said in the beginning, it doesn't care if it's causing you suffering. It wants to exist. So we have to change the I am at the very least to something that's healthy. If we're going to have an ego, which is just part of being human, so you're not going to get rid of it, but at least make it a healthy one. Right? Does that make sense? So getting out of the identity, getting into the feeling instead. So now this is going to sound funny because part of recognizing who we really are and finding absolute freedom and autonomy and liberation is knowing we are not this body. We are not this meat suit. Some people say to me, that sounds so horrible. We're not this avatar. But part of the process of getting out of suffering is you have to drop into your body. Because a huge source of suffering is the mind. So we have to go through these layers first, right? The reason why the mind can be both your prisoner, no, it can imprison you or it can liberate you is because it totally depends on how you perceive things, right? So if your mind is identifying with things that are untrue and that are judgmental of you or that are causing you suffering, your mind is going to imprison you, right? And it creates all sorts of illusions and fantasies and projections. It's not real. So one of the first steps of getting out of the suffering of the mind is come into the body, drop into the body. We have to go through these layers before we can even move beyond this, right? But we've got to work with what we have in this density. So you get out of the story of the mind, you get out of the beliefs and the identities, and you go into the feeling. It's not, I am rejected, I feel rejected. Okay, feel your feelings. We have a society that loves to distract. Feel your feelings and you will actually move through them much faster than you think. When we identify with things, when we resist things, we stay in the suffering much longer. When we actually go into the feeling, it might be acute for a moment or for a little bit. But normally when I guide people into their body and into their emotions and into their pain, they actually feel relief. You know why? Because that part actually feels finally felt and witnessed. And what more do we want? We want to be witnessed, seen, heard, understood. Right? So you come into the feeling. You come into the body and you feel the feeling. Don't get attached to it. Don't get identified with it. Don't go into the story of it. Don't give it a whole narrative. Just feel the feeling. And then recognize that you are not the feeling. That's part of the disidentification. You are not the feeling. So you feel it. Maybe you need to give it what it needs. Maybe it needs love always. Maybe it needs assurance. Maybe it needs validation from you, not from the external. What are we doing within us? Whatever we're yearning for from the outside is what we need to give ourselves from the inside. So we give ourselves what we need by embodying the very thing that we're yearning for. Then once we've alchemized the emotion, we can let it go. Doesn't have to hold on to the story, doesn't have to hold on to the identity, doesn't even need to hold on to the sensation anymore. It can move through. And somehow what comes up is the memory of Liz Gilbert was talking about grief. And she said, sometimes grief will literally just bring you to your knees and it's like a storm that comes in. She said it beautifully and eloquently, but I'm going to use my own words with it to give you the gist of it. But it will just sweep in and it will bring you to your knees. And I almost see this storm and then it will go. But while you're in the storm, even if it's 15 minutes, it can just feel like agony. But she was talking about mercy. Just mercy in that moment and how I see it is just surrender. When something brings you to your knees, bow down to it, be in surrender to it, let it rush through you in all its fury, and then let it go. It's when we grasp onto it and try to change it that we're actually keeping the storm in our hands rather than letting it sweep over us, because sometimes grief will sweep over you and it will bring you to your knees and it will hurt like hell, and then it moves on. The only constant in life is change. What keeps it from changing is when we hold on to it, and that is unnecessary suffering. You don't need to suffer. Let it go. And I know that it's easier said than done, but this is a practice. This is a perspective. This is a choice. We are getting out of victimization. We are getting out of being spiritual children. We're growing up and taking responsibility, recognizing our sovereignty, and recognizing that we have a choice, and everything is a reflection of what's going on inside of us. And we can change it with love. Now, another piece that I want to bring in here, as you're going through this process and you're making this choice, because at first it's not easy. It's not easy. We're undoing like potentially thousands of years, like multiple generations of habit, right? So give yourself a lot of compassion and patience. It's not going to happen right away. But as we recognize that we have this choice, that we can choose differently, that we can choose to not suffer and not be a victim and not kind of repeat our quote unquote karma. I don't like the word so much, but just again, using it because it's familiar. We're simultaneously dropping into ourselves on a deeper level. And I think part of this releasing suffering is also getting out of this something external that knows better than us, right? And in its worst form, it tends to be something that has authority and control over us. I'm not going to mention certain organizations that we give our power to. We think we have choice in it. We don't. It's all an illusion. Two wings of the same bird. And it controls us, right? But you can also see it in spiritual and religious ways that sometimes it's easy to hand over your life and authority to even God or even universe or even creator. And what we're recognizing is all of this is a state of being, and the state of being resides within us. So God is within you. Creator is within you. Source, universe, whatever you want to call it, consciousness is within you. It is not something that you pray to outside of yourself. It's something that you pray to within yourself. You are the vessel for this consciousness coming through you, God coming through you, your soul coming through you. So when we pray to open the vessel to receive that which needs to come through. I've had this kind of prayer every single day, literally since I was in my early 20s. So like 20 years, where I will kind of ground myself. And this is after all my meditations, whatever. I ground myself, and I really, now it's like, what do I say? May I be open to receiving that which needs to come through me today. As a woman, as a mother, as a human being, whatever you want to say, may I be open to receiving that which needs to come through me. I am just the vessel. So part of this process of releasing suffering is coming back into ourselves. This is why authenticity is so important. And this is why I feel like my mission is to guide people back home to who they truly are. We're just coming back home. And when you come back home into yourself, we know everything that we need to know. It's inside of us. But when I say know, it's not a knowledge like I'm going to go out and I'm going to read articles and I'm going to get a book from the library and I'm going to, well, does anybody go to the library anymore? I don't think so. Maybe some people do. That's kind of nice. When I say knowing, I mean a gnosis, wisdom is an embodiment. Wisdom isn't knowledge. Knowledge is what the mind goes out and seeks and does research, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but I actually think we're expanding beyond that because we've gotten a little too heavy on the left brain and the neocortex of like knowledge, science, proof, facts. But people actually are really missing their intuition. They're missing their own inner knowing, that gnosis, that wisdom that is in your being, that is in your DNA, that is connected to your soul, that is connected to source, that is running through you because you are of it. And I think what we're needing to do right now, if we really, really want to release ourselves from suffering, and if we really want to be sovereign, free beings, which we actually are, but in this human form, in this density, in this realm, we're playing with this idea that no, you're not free. But we actually are. But if we really, really, really want to do that, we have to come back into ourselves and remember our own wisdom. Remember our own knowing beyond this life. But even within this life, what if you made a decision not from a place of knowledge? What are the facts? What do I know? But what if you actually tuned into yourself and go, what is my inner knowing? What is my inner wisdom? People will spend a lot of money to go to psychics and tarot card readers and astrologers and all that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm not poo-pooing that. But we've so been trained to go outside of ourselves. Sometimes it's really useful for guidance, but not at the expense of thinking we don't have our own inner guidance, because we do. We just don't trust it, because sometimes we can't hear it because we've been so far removed. And if you're one that is very stuck in the drama of everything that's going on in the world, and you're being fed into the fear and the division and judgment, which is the opposite of love, right? If who we innately are is unconditional love, then when we are in judgment, we are the furthest away from our true essence. And we want to come back home. We want to come back to the knowing that we do know. We are intuitive. We are psychic. I mean, in our greatest, fullest powers, I believe that we are telepathic. I believe probably not in this lifetime, but I do believe we have to have reasons for why we use words like teletransportation, teleporting, and telekinesis. They must have existed at some point. I truly believe. I know that this is possible outside of this human body, which is why I get so frustrated that I'm like, how is this still not happening on planet Earth? I get really frustrated. We have so much inner knowing and so much inner wisdom. We just don't believe it and we don't trust it because everything in our external world is pointing us away from ourselves. It's distracting us. It's belittling us. It's patronizing us, saying you're not good enough. You're not beautiful enough. You need to look like this. Look at this latest magazine. Look at this latest model on social media. Look at this latest filter. That's what you should be. It's taking us away from us. No, I was going to use an analogy, but it's way too triggering, so I'm not going to do it. But, a lot of people now will look to a test of something rather than just check in with your body. Just literally check in with your body. Your body is so wise, it will tell you. We just have stopped listening. So one of the little kind of a practice that I've told people, for over 10 years now, when I used to do kind of manifesting workshops, manifesting your soulmate, which I would reword that now. Sorry, cracking my knuckles. Is don't just go to the grocery store and get the food that you always get just by kind of habit and by rote. Go in and actually tune into your body and go, what does my body feel like it needs tonight for dinner? Not just what do I normally make? What are my recipes? No, go into the grocery store and buy what you feel your body needs. Your body will tell you, right? Not your mind, your body. Your mind might be like, I want a fudge brownie. And who knows, maybe your body does really need that. Who knows, maybe you do need like a sugar hit. I'm not one to say, right? But the point is to start having a conversation with yourself. And we have to start believing again that we are so much more powerful than we believe that we are, and that we've been told, that we've been lied to, right? And never mind all of that stuff. Never mind quote unquote evil. Never mind quote unquote, controllers. Never, just stop playing the game. Come back home. Come back home to yourself. You get to not suffer anymore. But it means we have to go through these layers. Acknowledge what's happening. Recognize how you're identifying with it, the stories, the beliefs that go with it, the mind that is creating unnecessary suffering. Drop into your body. Feel the feeling. Don't identify with the feeling, but feel the feeling. Bring awareness into your daily experience and into your daily practice, and recognize that through awareness of your habits, of your behavior over time, you will be able to make a choice. When you can make a choice as to your behavior and your reaction, and you can change it, you are evolving. You are liberating yourself. You are becoming more conscious. You get to choose, do I want to continue to suffer or not? That in a nutshell is I don't want to say it's the process, because I'm sure there are many different processes. This is the process that I'm sharing with you today, that I've been through myself. But we have to go through that, right? And so then if you wanted to evolve all of that further, is to recognize you are not the body. The body is the vehicle. You're in relationship with the body. You have to have a healthy relationship to your body, to the vessel. Like, you want to take care of your car, right? You don't want to bash it around, treat it like shit, and not put petrol in it and not clean it, right? Take care of your car. Take care of your vehicle. And that includes not just the food that you put into it or the consciousness that you put into it, like what are you watching, but also how do you talk to your body? How do you talk to yourself? How do you talk to the personality, the human that is you? Are you kind? Remember, the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's judgment. And what this guy RJ said, and you see this actually even in the rice experiments, like the Dr. Emoto work that he did with water, and then you can do this with rice. I did this with my daughter at her school as well. Hatred, he says it sounds really weird, but hatred is actually closer to love than judgment is, because hatred has to have a kind of passion of emotion for it to be that intense. So sometimes you hate someone that you really loved and they betrayed you, and that's why you feel hate, because you love them and you are hurt. Judgment is just like, it's just mean. It sometimes is void of emotion. It is void of any kind of, like, there was never any love there. It was just judgment, right? So I think that it's really interesting. So basically, sorry, my point that I was trying to get to is like with the rice experiments that, well, in this case, you would think they had like love, hate, and ignoring. And ignoring came out worse than hatred, because hatred is still attention. Ignoring is like the worst of worst, right? So let's rein it in. I can't, with what I'm using now to record, I have no idea how long this is, so I'm sorry if it's terribly long. They're getting longer and longer every week, but I just feel like I'm being the vessel. It's coming through me. I know when to stop. It will tell me when I'm done. So bear with me, but we're coming to the end. So we get to choose now. We get to choose. Do we want to continue to suffer or not? Do we want to continue to play this game that we can only evolve through suffering? Or do we want to say, like, it's a wrap, right? And let's put a new game in. Let's move towards joy. Let's take our lessons, like let's use the duality and see the wisdom, not the knowledge, but the wisdom that we've gleaned from it, that we've garnered from it, right? From greed to generosity, from judgment to love and compassion, from suffering to joy. Let's take the duality and let's evolve it. Let's grow and go to the next level of evolution. And then we get to play in that experience, because remember, it's just an experience. No good, no bad, no right, no wrong. So the invitation today is to ask yourself the question, do I want to continue to suffer? And if the answer is no, then you got to be really honest with yourself. In what ways am I colluding with the patterns and the beliefs and the identities that are causing me suffering? In what ways am I still choosing to be a victim, whether it's conscious or not? I'm going to make the unconscious conscious so I can bring awareness into my life, and I can choose differently, and therefore I can change the course of my life, and I can change my experience. I can change my reality. And then by doing that, I create a ripple effect. And just through my own magnetism, I am part of changing the world around me, because as within, so without. So you can change the world. You are not too small. And if we all do it together, we change the world. And the more we do this, the faster it's going to change. And don't we want that? And yes, letting go of an identity is scary. We're identified with it. So you might have to go through the crumbling and the who the hell am I? And oh my God, this is so scary. I'm jumping off a cliff, and you're going to have faith that you're either going to grow wings or a net is going to be there to catch you. But it's the only way through, my friends. It's the only way through. And as always, like before I ever work with someone, I say this process, the biggest things that this process is going to require is compassion, forgiveness, and patience. So take those things. Ask yourself the questions. Where am I colluding with my own suffering? Where am I attaching myself to the victim? And how can I bring awareness so I can begin to make different choices and make the choice eventually to let go of suffering? To be free, which is who we innately, naturally are. To be sovereign, to be authentic. Remember what I said, authenticity is 4,000 times more powerful than love. This was from last week. We are walking each other home to our authentic self, where we are our free, sovereign, infinite, immortal souls. Having this human experience, but let's make this experience through this vessel one that no longer needs to learn through suffering, but through bliss and joy and gratitude and love and generosity and kindness instead. So there's the invitation. As always, take it or leave it as feels right for you, and loving you from afar. You've been listening to Raw Conversations with Corinne Bloom. Thanks so much for showing up, listening in, and being a part of the conversation with me.